Hey, anatomy and physiology. If you haven't gotten a chance to meet me yet, my name is Mr. Stanley, and this class is going to be all about the human body. So, for our very first set of notes and assignments, we're going to be looking at the digestive system, how we take in food, how it travels through our body, and what happens at each step of the way. So, the digestive system. Digestion is all about taking food, breaking it down inside of your body into a form that your body can use. So as you're eating food and swallowing it, your body can't just use it right away. It has to break it down into smaller and smaller pieces. And that is what digestion is all about. The phases of digestion, so kind of the steps that the food goes through, are ingestion, so actually eating it, movement, so moving it through your body from your mouth to your stomach, to your intestines and into your large intestine. Digestion in two different stages: mechanical, chewing and grinding and breaking things down, and chemical, using chemicals to dissolve different parts of the food. Absorption, probably the most important part of digestion, actually taking the nutrients that are in your stomach and intestines and absorbing them into your bloodstream so that your blood cells and your tissues can get them as well. And then finally, elimination, getting rid of all the stuff that your body doesn't need. So, like I mentioned in that past slide, there are two main types of digestion: mechanical and chemical. Mechanical digestion is like physical motion of the food, moving it around, crushing it, grinding it, all sorts of stuff like that. So chewing it with your mouth and your teeth, tearing it using those like incisors right on the corner of your mouth to tear apart different chunks. Grinding it, so using those molars way in the back of your mouth in order to break and break and break the food down into small pieces. Mashing it together, so some of this happens with your tongue inside of your mouth, and some of this also happens with your stomach moving around, contracting, and smushing the food up. And then finally, mixing it around, getting all the different types of food all mixed together and mixed in with all the different chemicals and stuff you're adding. Because up next is when you have chemical digestion. Instead of using motion and force to break apart the food, we're using chemicals. So enzymes, things that are produced by your stomach that break down food, and also stomach acid. So the contents of your stomach are really acidic, and this helps food to start dissolve and break down as soon as it hits those stomach acids. So here we have kind of our entire digestive system from our mouth traveling down into our stomach and our small and large intestines, with some other guys on the side that we'll talk about in a little bit. So the digestive system happens inside of the GI tract. So the gastrointestinal tract is basically just a name for this tube that carries things from your mouth all the way down through your stomach and intestines, all the way out your body through your anus. So this is a direct link from one organ to the other. We're going inside of one to inside of the next one to inside of the next one. We start with our mouth up here, travel through our pharynx, kind of here at the top, and then down through the esophagus, this big long tube, into the stomach, down in here. That then passes the food into the small intestine, all this wibbly wobbly stuff down in here, and then finally through the large intestine. So your food is traveling through this long series of tubes from the start to the end. So the first thing that we're going to look at is where digestion begins with the mouth, where we actually get food from the outside world into our body. Break it up, start breaking down different components, help kill some of the germs that might be on our food, and moisten it for the rest of its journey through that GI tract. So the mouth is all about the teeth and the tongue. These are what are really breaking down the different foods and different tissues that we're eating into smaller pieces that our esophagus and our stomach can handle. So the teeth does a ton of mechanical digestion. That's doing the tearing, the grinding, the mashing, all that fun stuff. And our tongue is helping do that as well. So it's mixing stuff around, pushing it to our teeth to get mashed. But mechanical digestion is not the only thing that happens in our mouth. We also have a little bit of chemical digestion. So the saliva that's in your mouth, the spit that's hanging around in there, that contains an enzyme called amylase. And amylase is what breaks down starch. So things like bread, crackers, pasta, stuff like that, its digestion, along with all of the mechanical chewing digestion, some chemical digestion of it also happens in the mouth, also happens with that saliva that kind of coats the food and starts to break down those starch molecules before it even passes the rest of the way into your body. So we have chemical and mechanical digestion happening inside of the mouth. Breaking stuff down with our teeth and dissolving stuff with our saliva. So eventually we need to swallow our food in order to get it down into our stomach. And when this happens, it's very, very important that we do not get that food into our lungs and our windpipe. Only air is supposed to go in our lungs. If any food or water gets in there, that causes a big problem. Luckily, there is a little flap right in the back of your throat, this kind of brownish thing right here, called the epiglottis. So it's this little flap of cartilage, kind of like the stuff in your nose, that closes over your windpipe and stops food from entering your lungs. So when you're breathing, the epiglottis is up, like it is right here. And so your windpipe, which is this section, is nice and open because you want air to go from your nose and your mouth down into your lungs this way. But when we swallow something like this greenish food clump right here, we do not want that to happen. This getting into our lungs, bad, bad, bad news. So instead, when you swallow, you do that swallowing motion, the epiglottis flaps down, closes off the windpipe, so it can't go in the windpipe anymore. And instead, now our food has to travel down through our esophagus into the stomach. So this prevents there being any water or food getting into our lungs. You swallow, the epiglottis flaps down, and now all the food can't go into your lungs. It has to go down into your stomach, which is where we want it to go anyways. So once it gets past the epiglottis, then we travel into the esophagus, which is basically just this big long tube that connects the mouth to the stomach. In order to get stuff to move down there, yeah, gravity helps a little bit, but the epiglottis is usually pretty tightly contracted. And so we need to move the food down through this tube. So we use something called peristalsis. This is basically just a fancy word for muscles in your throat that you don't control directly. It happens all on its own. Gently kind of do this wavy motion and slowly push the food down into our stomach. So these involuntary contractions that kind of ripple along your throat and get that food from the very top of your esophagus down actually into your stomach, down in here. So the esophagus, it's essentially just a big long tube. It doesn't really do any digestion, doesn't really absorb anything. It just carries food from the mouth to the stomach. So from here to down here. That's all that the epiglottis or that the esophagus is doing. So it does secrete some mucus to kind of help the food glide along. And then, like we were just talking about, it uses that peristalsis, that kind of wavy motion along the esophagus to help move the food down into your stomach. So there's a little cutoff right where the esophagus meets the stomach, where it prevents stomach acid and food from coming back up. So if that ever happens, that's where something like heartburn comes from, because your stomach is a very acidic environment and it can damage any unprotected cells like the ones that are in your esophagus. So if stomach acid comes back up and into your esophagus, that's where that burning sensation comes from, and that's where heartburn comes from. All right, so we talked about how we have two different kinds of digestion that are already happening inside of your mouth: mechanical and physical. So if we do a lot of chewing, we're using our teeth to chew down on something like a saltine, that is mechanical digestion, right? We're using force, we're grinding stuff against each other and breaking that down. On the other side, if the saliva in our mouth starts to break down some of those starch molecules, some of those glucose molecules in there, that is chemical digestion. So we're using chemicals to break down the food into smaller pieces. If we have like a piece of hamburger or something in there, we're using our tongue to kind of force it around, push it all around in our mouth. That's mechanical digestion. So we're using force, we're using physical motion in order to break stuff down. But if we get that food into our stomach and we get an enzyme like pepsin that starts to work at that hamburger and starts to chemically force it apart, then that is chemical digestion. So we've done the mouth, we've moved through the esophagus, and now we're getting down into our stomach, where we're going to continue killing any germs that might be there. They don't like the acidity of your stomach. Do some more digestion, not just chemical digestion, but also physical, and store food for a brief period of time. So these sphincters are what I was talking about. There's one right here at the beginning of your stomach and one right here at the end of your stomach. And these are what hold stuff in the stomach and prevent it from either going back up through your esophagus or from going down into your intestine if the time is not right. So these sphincters will only open when it's time to let stuff into the stomach or out into the intestine. So our stomach is this weird kind of J-shaped organ down in here. It's where your food gets stored as it's being mechanically and chemically digested and before it's ready to move on to the small intestine. We have all these gastric juices that are secreted, so all these mixtures of enzymes and acid that are going to help break down that food chemically. And the stomach also has some layers of muscle around the inside because the stomach does some mechanical digestion as well. So when there's food in there and it's getting broken down by those chemicals, the stomach will also kind of contract back and forth, mush the food around, mix it around a little bit, and do some extra mechanical digestion on top of the chemical digestion that's already going on with all of the enzymes and acids and stuff like that. So the food comes in, it's in kind of these big clumps, and the stomach's going to break it down into even smaller pieces. So those gastric juices, those digestive juices that I mentioned earlier, those have all these enzymes that are going to break down all sorts of things, especially proteins and lipids. Stomach is very acidic, so it helps to kill any bacteria as well as help break down some of the food. So as the food moves through our stomach, we can store it there. We have this extremely acidic, so a pH of 2 is very, very, very acidic. The pH scale only goes up to 14, and 7 is like the neutral zone where water is. So 2 is at the very, very acid part of the scale. We have a lot of chemical digestion going on in the stomach, like I mentioned. We have pepsin, which helps to break down the proteins. It's released from these little edges of the stomach down here, kind of these little holes. These contain all sorts of different juices and acids that will be released out into the stomach itself in order to break down the food that's being held there. So a lot of times when people first learn about stomach acid, then they think, wait a second, if the whole purpose of the stomach acid is to break down cells in the food, how does the stomach not digest itself? How do the cells of the stomach prevent themselves from being injured? The answer is that there is a mucus layer inside the wall of the stomach, kind of similar to the mucus in your nose, but it coats the inside of your stomach, and that is what prevents the acid and the chemicals from breaking down your stomach cells. The acid and the enzymes can't get through that mucus, and so your stomach cells are protected. So, after we have to move out of the stomach, the next place we move into is the small intestine. This huge series of kind of tubing that wraps all the way around itself inside kind of the middle of what you think of like your gut. So whenever you point to your gut, you're not actually pointing to your stomach, that's a little bit higher up. You're pointing to your small intestine. The small intestine is about 7 meters long. So it's a 20-foot long rope, essentially, or tube, that's been kind of squished and coiled up and jammed into your guts. But if you took it out and stretched it out all the way, you'd end up with a 20-foot long tube of intestines. So the small intestine is all about absorbing. It's trying to absorb every single different nutrient that's coming out of the food that we're digesting. So it has these little finger-like projections called villi that kind of coat the inside walls of the small intestine and basically just sit there and try to absorb all the food as it travels through. We'll look at a picture of what these look like in a second, but they're called villi and they stick out of the walls and try to absorb the food that's been passing by. Additionally, not only do we have these villi at the surface of our small intestine, the villi themselves are covered with even tinier villi called microvilli, which do further absorption, which further increase the ability of the small intestine to pick up nutrients and absorb them into the bloodstream. So here's kind of what we're working with. So we have this big tube of the small intestine. Food is passing through like this way. And then along this tube are kind of these big ridges going up and down right here. And then along the walls of the ridges are the villi. So millions and billions of these villi are coating the walls of your intestines and basically just kind of sitting there, letting the food pass by them and absorbing all the nutrients that they can. On top of these villi, all these tiny little projections right here, these are our microvilli. And these are what are sticking out of the villi themselves in order to get even more coverage of the food and the liquid that's moving through. So your small intestine is just absolutely coated in these projections, which are all about absorbing nutrients. Once the nutrients get absorbed by the villi, they pass into our bloodstream. So that's what's going on right here. Each one of our villi in our small intestine has this bloodstream running through it. And so the nutrients go from our GI tract, this tube of the small intestine, into our bloodstream. And that is where they're able to be carried out later on and passed on to the other cells in our body. It's because they're connected to those cells thanks to our bloodstream. So the food gives off nutrients as it gets broken down. Those get absorbed by the villi and passed into the bloodstream. So we get a whole lot of water, right? Because we're humans, we need a lot of water to live. And we don't want to just be getting rid of it every time that we pee or poop. And so we absorb a lot of the water. We get things like vitamins that our foods contains, the different minerals that are in there. and then some major nutrients like carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. The small intestine also does a little bit of digestion itself, so it has some digestive enzymes that it also secretes in order to get that process going. But like you can see from this picture here, it's all about getting those nutrients. So here's where our small intestines are, and these blue kind of tree branching thingies are all showing the bloodstream that is taking those nutrients and then taking them out of the small intestine and most likely up to the heart, where they can then be pumped out to the rest of the body. So just as a kind of overview, we have our small intestine, this huge thing of tubes. It does chemical digestion and does major absorption of our nutrients. We have 6 to 7 meters of lining that if you were to take all of those villi and completely flatten them out against the ground and completely flattened out your small intestines, you'd be able to cover about the area of a tennis court, over 300 square meters of absorbing villi throughout your small intestine. So the small intestine is made up of 3 different sections. The duodenum is where it connects right to the stomach. So like the short little section right after the stomach is called the duodenum. The jejunum is kind of like the middle part of the small intestine. This is where most of the absorption is going on, all of our different nutrients and water. And then the ileum is right at the end of the small intestine, and this is where it is about to be passed through to the large intestine. So the jejunum and the ileum are important, but the one we're going to mostly focus on up next is the duodenum, also known as the duodenum by some people. And so this is where we have the stomach and the small intestine meeting up. The stomach's passing all of its mashed up food to the small intestine, where we're going to continue doing some digestion and also get started on our absorption. So the duodenum, so we have our stomach right here. We go through the little sphincter into the duodenum through here. And so this is where we get the acid from the stomach and all of the different mixtures of enzymes from the stomach around our food, combined with juices from the pancreas down here, the liver, this big guy up here, and the gallbladder, this little guy right here. All of these guys send extra digestive juices down into the small intestine at the duodenum right here. These 3 guys we'll talk about a little bit more later on. They are not directly part of the digestive system because food doesn't travel through the liver or the gallbladder or the pancreas. It just goes straight from the stomach to the small intestine, but they do contribute some stuff to the digestive process. But like I said, we'll get to them a little bit later. So we pass through the stomach into the duodenum of the small intestine. We pass through all the other parts down there, and then eventually, once we've done most of our absorption of our body, we pass that food on to our large intestine. So this big kind of square looking thing surrounding our small intestine, kind of going out, up, and around, is the large intestine. This guy's a lot shorter than the small intestine. He's about 5 feet long. It's called the large intestine because the diameter, so the tube itself, is a lot bigger than the little tube of our small intestine, but it's also a lot shorter. Basically, the large intestine is the last call for absorption. So any nutrients or minerals or water that didn't get absorbed by the small intestine are going to be absorbed by the large intestine. So the very end of the large intestine down here is the rectum, and this is where we store, basically where your poop is stored before it's expelled from your body. And so as your large intestine is pulling out all these different absorptive materials, all the leftover stuff, the stuff that your body wasn't able to break down or couldn't absorb, that's going to be collected as your feces or your poop and stored in the rectum until it's time to go to the bathroom and get rid of it. So by the time we get to the large intestine, we've absorbed most of the water and liquid that's in our small intestine, and so we're left with some leftover water and a lot of solid material that's moving through the large intestine. So anything that you couldn't digest, like fiber from plants, or anything else that couldn't be broken down, those are what are going to be collected together, and the large intestine is stored as feces in your rectum. Right down here. Large intestine is also the final stage for water absorption. Like I said, your body wants to do as much as possible in order to hold on to any water that comes through. And so your small intestine absorbs a lot of water, but your large intestine is the last stop for water absorption. It's trying to pull all the water that it can out of this material that's left over so that you don't get rid of a lot of water when you go to the bathroom and go poop. So the rectum stores it and then gets rid of it when it's time to go to the bathroom. So we do a little bit more digestion in the large intestine. We break down kind of the final proteins and carbohydrates that are hanging on. We absorb a lot of the water, so it's kind of like a liquidy mass as it gets into the large intestine. But when it pulls all that water out, that's when it kind of solidifies and concentrates it into the feces, into the poop. So we come in here from our small intestine. As we go through, we're absorbing water, concentrating waste, absorbing water, concentrating waste, until finally in the rectum, we're storing all that concentrated waste until it's time to get rid of it. But again, all about reabsorbing that water. We want to try to get as little water as possible to pass out of our large intestine when we go to the. If you do not absorb enough water out of your large intestine, that's when you get diarrhea, too much water in your stool, in your feces. And so if the large intestine, if something's going on in your large intestine and it's not functioning correctly and it's not absorbing the water that it's supposed to be absorbing, that's when you get something like diarrhea. If you have the opposite problem, your large intestine is absorbing too much water, or you're not taking enough water in with your food and there's no more water to be pulled out, that's when you get constipation. So your feces actually becomes too concentrated, kind of too hardened and compacted. And now it feels very uncomfortable because there's not enough water to kind of help move it along through the process. So if we do a bad job of absorbing water, you get diarrhea. Or if your large intestine is working overtime and you're absorbing too much water, then you get constipation. So it's all about kind of finding that balance, reabsorbing all the water that you can, but not too much that it causes stuff to start to get backed up. All right, so that is the final stage of where our food moves through in our digestive system, right? It enters at our mouth, travels down that esophagus tube, goes through our stomach and gets digested, goes through the small intestine and gets absorbed, and then goes through the large intestine and our waste gets concentrated. That's all the organs that the food sees. But there's some other ones called accessory organs that also help out. And you might remember I mentioned these a second ago. They are the liver, the gallbladder, which is usually kind of small and tucked up under the liver, and the pancreas, which is hiding out here behind the stomach. And so these guys are not a part of the path of food. Food will never pass through your liver, your gallbladder, or your pancreas. They don't see the food directly. But they do give off some extra enzymes and chemicals that help to break down the food as it goes through your small intestine. So we'll start with we have the pancreas down here. Like I said, he kind of hides behind the stomach if you're looking at him from the front. He produces extra enzymes to help with digestion of food. You have your liver up here, which for digestion produces bile, which is going to help to break up fat that we eat. And then the gallbladder, little guy right underneath the liver, stores the bile that the liver produces. So we'll start talking about the liver. It's a pretty big organ. It's one of the largest organs in your body. It sits right up here, kind of just up to the left of the stomach. And so it produces bile to help with digestion. The liver does a lot of other jobs as well, but in terms of digestion and the digestive system, we're going to mostly focus on the bile that it produces. So bile is really, really important because it helps us digest fat. So any fats, any lipids that you're bringing into your body, your mouth and your stomach and your small intestine do a sort of okay, mediocre job of breaking it down. But the bile that comes out of the liver is really the superstar when it comes to getting rid of this fat. So the liver also helps with digestion a little bit in terms of doing some filtering. So like drugs or alcohol that you take in through your mouth and that end up in your stomach, those can go up to the liver and help to be filtered out a little bit as well. But in terms of actually helping the digestion process, it's all about using that bile to digest fat. So the liver makes the bile. It's kind of the bile production center. A lot of the times it makes a lot of bile, and so a lot of the extra can be stored in this gallbladder right here. So the bile contains colors from old red blood cells that have collected in the liver, which have a little bit of iron in them. So iron is a really important part of your blood, and it's in your blood cells. And so, fun fact, as the bile breaks down that fat and then gets digested and compacted by the large intestine, the iron in those red blood cells rusts, and that's what makes your poop look brown, is because of all this kind of oxidized iron that's in the red blood cells that go into making up the bile, or parts of the bile. So liver does bile production, and bile is what helps us to break down fats. And like I mentioned earlier, that bile ends up getting put into the duodenum of the small intestine thanks to this little series of tubes right here that I'll talk about in just a second. So the gallbladder is kind of like, I like to think of him as like the liver's little buddy. He's this really small little sac that kind of hides right underneath the liver, right on them. And he helps to store the bile that the liver produces. So the liver is making bile a lot, and our stomach and our small intestine don't always need the bile right away. Maybe it's been a while since you ate food. So in order to make sure that we have plenty of bile when the food does end up coming through, it gets stored inside of our little gallbladder right here. And so when the food does move from the stomach to the small intestine, it gets the signal to release the bile, and we can do a lot of fat digestion with the amount of bile that's stored up in there. But the gallbladder is literally just there to be a storage sac for the liver. So if you eat too much fat in your diet, some of it can actually end up causing problems for your gallbladder, called gallstones. And the bile itself is this kind of really gross liquid. It's this really kind of nasty greenish yellowish liquid that breaks apart fats by, here is like one little molecule of bile, and it basically surrounds the fat and helps to break it into smaller and smaller pieces. So as you start to eat, as that digestion starts to happen, that's the signal for the bile to be released from the gallbladder and moved into the duodenum. So our final accessory organ, our little pancreas, right down in here, kind of hiding behind the stomach. This guy produces a wide range of digestive enzymes. So a whole bunch of different enzymes that help the stomach and small intestine to break down a lot of the different types of nutrients that are coming in. They help to break down fats, carbohydrates, and proteins, all of which we'll be talking about a little bit later on in the week. They also do a really good job of helping regulate your blood sugar. So people with diabetes, which is a fairly common disease, have issues with their pancreas producing insulin, and it either isn't doing a very good job, that's for people with type 2 diabetes, or it never produced insulin. It's not making any insulin whatsoever, and that's when people have type 1 diabetes. Insulin helps to regulate your blood sugar level, so it helps to essentially break down your blood sugar if there's too much of it in your blood through your digestive system. So we got our pancreas down here, sending stuff into the duodenum to help break down proteins, help break down starches. But that's not the only thing that it is sending. It is also sending a group of chemicals called buffers, which are very important because they actually neutralize the acid that's coming from the stomach. So remember I said that the stomach is very acidic. That helps kill those germs and start breaking down our food. Our pancreas, or excuse me, our small intestine, unlike the stomach, this does not have a lot of that mucus covering to keep it safe. So if too much stomach acid were to get into our small intestine, that could actually cause problems. That could actually cause damage to those cells. So how do they fix this problem? The stomach still sends basically all of its food and chemicals and acid into the small intestine, but the pancreas, our good buddy down here, he makes these buffers which helps to neutralize, cancel out that acid. So as it moves through the rest of the small intestine, we don't have a super acidic solution moving through and damaging the cells. We've neutralized it and brought it a little bit closer up to neutral, up to that pH of 7 that like water would be at. So not only does the pancreas help to regulate our blood sugar, it also gives the small intestine a whole bunch of extra digestive enzymes to help it out breaking down our food. And it sends these buffers to help cancel out the effects of the very acidic contents from the stomach. So that is everything that you guys need to know about the process and structures associated with digestion. As always, if you have any questions about anything or want some more explanation or clarification, you can come to our Zoom office hours or send me an email, send me a text, and I'll do my best to help you out. Good luck, and I'll see you for our next set of notes in a day.